Back on Morning Line with us this morning is Thomas Schwartz. We're talking about, he's from Vanderbilt, specializes in American foreign affairs, and obviously the Ukraine situation. Callers with thoughts as we just discuss it, broad-based, what's going on. It's you know, the talk of the world right now, and we don't know how long it's going to continue. But you have your opinion on that. We have James who waited through the break, so we'll take his call. James, good morning. What's on your mind, James? Hi, James.
Good morning, guys. How y'all doing?
Good. What's on your mind? Are you there, sir?
I think if we take a real good close look at Trump and his extended family, we're going to find a much closer relationship with Russia than most people know.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, what do you mean? Just a business relationship? I know he had some business interests in the country and the like.
No, his family.
And his family?
No, his family. People that married into his family, his wife, all of them. You take a good hard look at it. I can't say on here because it'll start a storm, but he's got enough good detectives in the world. You take a good look at that boy. He ain't clean.
Okay, well, but of course he's not in power now, and I don't know. I mean, yeah, but Trump, like I said, he did have some business interests. I don't know what he's referring to there.
Yeah, well, there's, you know, he was trying to start a hotel.
Yeah, right.
He had people around him who wanted to have closer ties, and Trump himself often spoke about the fact that we should have close ties with Russia, and he believed very much that that was in the interest of the United States. So he certainly signaled during his administration that he wanted that. But as I mentioned, there were contradictory things going on, sanctions as well as attempts to overcome them.
Right. All right, let's get back to the question, the military response and the conflict, and wanting, obviously, China wants to keep it down. The U.S. doesn't like the idea of Poland sending planes over to help in the fight to escalate it militarily. Is against the backdrop of all of this going on, in the back of our president's mind and maybe the European leaders, would Putin use a nuclear weapon? I don't know that he would want to nuke Ukraine because he wants that to become part of his country. But would he use it against another country maybe that he feels is coming after him unfairly?
It's certainly people who follow Putin believe that he might be willing, because he was willing, for example, to tolerate and to, you know, we don't know whether he encouraged, but the Syrians to use chemical weapons when he was supporting them in their civil war. There is this notion, tactical nuclear weapons don't have to be huge to have an impact. I mean, he's got a lot of small nuclear weapons, and so it's possible if there were an escalation that he might use a tactical nuclear weapon to scare off the West from any sort of escalation. It's possible, one would think that the nuclear taboo has been very strong in the world. It's the 70 plus years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's been no use of a nuclear weapon in combat, and so I would think that even though he likes to saber rattle, that he would, cooler heads would prevail and he wouldn't use one. But it's a good threat, and it certainly has limited our willingness to do anything.
Would this have been any different of a conflict had Ukraine had nuclear weapons?
Yes, I think Ukraine would have been willing for survival. It's similar in this case.
It would have given Putin pause.
Oh, absolutely.
So there you see, I mean, it's that whole the mutually assured destruction thing is that you wonder, nuclear weapons is a shame. If you can snap your finger and they all disappear, that's great. But when one has them and one doesn't, no. But when both have them, it can be a means toward peace because no one wants to set it off.
Well, Ukraine had nuclear weapons after the end of the Soviet Union. There were lots of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It gave them up in 1994 over a promise that its territorial integrity would be respected by Russia. So, in effect, Russia has violated the Budapest Memorandum that was Ukraine when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons.
Let's take a call next from Brian, I believe. Brian, are you there, Brian?
No, this is not Brian.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got it backwards. Go ahead, Eric. We'll get Brian next. Go ahead, Eric.
Okay. You know, Nick, one of the things that I'm kind of concerned about is the situation where I think we have 3 Americans that are in prison over there. The whole situation, I'm probably sure you heard about this with Brittney Griner and the fact that she was trying to get out, but the whole thing with, I guess, cannabis oil and everything. There's another American, I believe this family was fighting to get him out. He's been there for 2 years because of a charge they say was false. I don't know if he got into a fight in a bar or if he attacked somebody or some over there, official. I don't know what the deal is. And there are reports down here, and he's sick in prison. their family's trying to get him medical care, and they can't get him medical care over there. And there's another guy, I think, an issue with marijuana. Because one of the things I've heard, too, is, you know, and not to try and blame or anything, is all the situation when you go to another country, you have to be very, very careful and know the laws about issues of things like, I guess, drugs, firearms, or just anything, because of the fact that while it may not be a problem here, of course, you're in another country, you could either get thrown in prison or lose a limb or even get executed, depending on where you are. And it's teaching Americans they've got to be very, very careful wherever you go. But what is the American government, what are we trying to do now to try and get those 3 individuals out? Because I know this is a very tenuous situation. You don't want to get too high profile because being politicized and everything.
Sure. No, I mean, Brittney Griner is the one that's made it.
Yes.
She's one of the best women basketball players in the world, basketball player period in the world, and she, you know, plays in the WNBA, but she makes a fraction here that she makes playing for a Russian professional team, where she makes over $1 million a year, and played there. And so you're wondering, what was she doing in Russia? Well, she was playing basketball. Now, here's my thing with Brittney Griner. If she indeed was caught with hash oil, which she knows is illegal going through Russia, then, I mean, I understand our consulate's going to become involved, but I don't want her situation should have absolutely no bearing on our approach to Ukraine. There better not be any quid pro quo, like, you know, Putin saying, well, I'll let her go if you back up. No, sorry, Brittney, but that's not the way it's going to work for you. We'll go through the normal channels to try to get you back, but her, and I don't know about the other 2 cases he's talking, you don't imagine they have any bearing whatsoever on the U.S. approach to dealing with Russia and Ukraine. Because if we are, that's wrong. I'm sorry. Brittney, she's busted with pot. You're going to have to deal with it now. That was not smart.
Unfortunately, though, countries have begun to think that taking Americans or charging them, I mean, and the real criminal in this is Iran, which has imprisoned a number of Americans on false charges, and then basically thought to ransom them, as they did with the hostages back in 1979. And so they have set an example of this. North Korea as well, with the poor college student who died. So this is a problem around the world, and Americans have to be extraordinarily careful, because this can be used. They can be used as diplomatic pawns.
They could. Now, do you think, though, Griner could be a diplomatic pawn in the Ukraine crisis?
Of course, yeah. And it doesn't mean that I think we'll give any concessions, but she could be a diplomatic pawn that Putin might offer.
Maybe where you say, hey, listen, I'll get her back to your country now. Maybe trying to curry some favor or positivity there. Yeah. That's true, and that's what's frustrating there. So I certainly hope those Americans get back safe and sound, but my other part of it, I guess you're there for different reasons, but I mean, boy, certain parts of the world, I'm like, what are you doing there? Now, she was there making $1 million a year. Right. I don't blame her. Let's go next to Brian. Brian, good morning. Hi, Brian.
Yes.
Hey.
Yeah, I have a question about the long-term security of Europe and what role that Germany plays, and also NATO, because the U.S. can't constantly be in Europe for the next 200 or 300 years, securing Europe. And the 2 big players in Europe is obviously Germany and Russia. And how should and will Germany stand up to Russia for the long-term security of Europe?
Great question, because, you know, so often, maybe talk about Germany. I'm glad he brought that up. I mean, Germany is one of the major powers, obviously, in Europe. Very big, very powerful. And a lot of times they stand aside and don't. And they came out real early on in this conflict and took a lead role, didn't they?
Well, they waited until the invasion.
Oh, I know. I mean, once the invasion happened, though. But a lot of times, sometimes Germany's more reticent. They're back. They don't know. But this time, it seemed like they were more involved.
It's a complicated story, and I spent a lot of time studying U.S.-German relations.
Okay.
Germany suffers from a lot of guilt. German leaders, they perceive what Germany did during World War II, particularly in Russia. And so they've had this theory that engaging Russia, bringing Russia into the world economy, having a diplomatic dialogue. Angela Merkel, the chancellor there for so many years, used to meet with Putin and speak Russian with him. She learned Russian. You know, she had known him, and so they've had this notion that Russia could be appeased if you sort of tried to integrate or bring Russia into the European sphere. In that sense, the invasion was a huge wake-up call, because I think they had believed that good relations would prevent this type of military aggression, and they had let their military decline severely. Their military was training with broomsticks. I mean, they didn't even have weapons. So this has been a wake-up call. Germany has really responded quite dramatically. They haven't cut off oil imports yet, but they have basically committed to massive rearmament and to beginning to be playing a bigger role. This is probably one of the most interesting consequences of the whole crisis, has been the degree that it has changed German public opinion.
Okay, and so is this hard to say then with his question long term in Europe then? And
yeah, the question is, will it last?
Yeah.
Germany has been shocked, but there are some strong interests there, economic particularly. They have tremendous economic connections to Russia that might over time reassert themselves. But right now, Germany is very committed and against what Putin has done.
And as far as just looking at Europe as a whole, some call this now, it's a war in Europe. But I mean, is there any belief out there that after Ukraine, Putin has designs beyond to go further into Europe, realistically?
Eastern Europeans worry about that a great deal.
All the time.
Yeah, the Baltic states, for example,
Yeah.
all worry. They have vulnerabilities. They're right on the border with Russia. They're small. They could be. The Baltic states were easily conquered back in 1940 by what was the Soviet Union.
What
then.
about beyond the Baltic states?
Poland. Poland certainly worries about its own border with Russia. There's been hostility there. There's complicated relationship with Russia of both love-hate, sort of a lot of hate there because of Russia's own role in dominating Poland during the Cold War. So yes, there are great worries. In fact, one of the subtext in what happened with those jets was that Poland was trying to force us to do something by coming out without consultation with the U.S. by saying they would give the jets to the Ukraine, and then this put the U.S. in the position of having to say no, and this was something I think the Biden administration did not want to do.
Okay. Let's go to Taylor. Taylor, good morning. Hi, Taylor.
Good morning, Nick, and good morning to the professor. I wasn't going to call until the professor mentioned Angela Merkel and the former chancellor of Germany, and the biggest problem goes back to several years to when she was talking about speaking Russian. She was a native of East Germany, so she knew a lot about the Russian way of business. But my point is, she thought that she could work with Putin in those earlier days, and thought she really had an insight into him. And that is when they agreed, in order to get better, cheaper fuel and electricity, they would put that first pipeline from Russia into Germany, and they started shutting down their nuclear plants, and they and Italy, and Italy's an interesting situation. It's not worth talking about, but the two of them just kept building up more and more dependence on that Russian oil, and it's led to where we are now.
Interesting.
I don't think they ever thought it would wind up being that dependent. That really has fueled the economy of Russia for several years and helped him build up reserves that he thought he could work from. And I would like to make one other point. All this talk about Trump and his Russian affiliation. I saw a speech that he gave in front of the entire NATO organization at one time. All the leaders of NATO were there, as was their NATO staff. He sat there and blasted Germany for the fact of their, instead of paying the 2% into the NATO alliance, they were only paying 1%. And his remarks to them was, you're wanting us to pay 4.5%, you pay 1%, and at the same time, you're buying all this fuel from a country that we're spending this money to protect.
I had to cut him off because we're getting to the break, but I do remember that very
Yes,
speech.
absolutely right.
And he's right. Taylor, you're right about that. There may be something to this. You just wonder if the Russians recognize, let's get these other countries as dependent as possible on our oil, and they'll be loathed when the time comes, as we're seeing right now. I don't know. Is Germany going to be able to say we're not going to buy Russian oil? And that gets into the whole issue of alternatives. And by the way, there are a lot of alternatives out there, especially for the U.S. I mean, Canada, Mexico, our own oil that we could ramp up. But you wonder.
You do. And I mean, he was right that Trump called Germany out on that. He did it rather crudely, and it certainly ruffled feathers. But he was right that Germany was making this dependence, because the Germans really thought they understood the Russians. They thought that if they dealt with them effectively, they could sort of take away that aggressive character. They have this belief that they ended the Cold War that way, that the Cold War came to an end because of that, rather than military pressure.
Take a break on that note. When we come back, more of your phone calls, Michael and others. Stay where you are as we're talking Ukraine with a good professor here right after this.
We wake up each and every day